Hey everyone, it's Mario Peshev here, and I'm really excited to be on WordSesh 3. It's a great online conference for WordPress, and it's one of the best things that could have happened to the industry, having all of the top players taking part in one way or the other in the WordSesh organization, which is super exciting. So if it's the first time you're watching WordSesh, just share it with your friends and tell all of your buddies to just hang out and just learn from the top industry leaders. It would be fairly exciting for everyone to just learn all the new things happening in the industry from WordSesh. So my talk is going to be about the WordPress code architecture. I've been spending quite some time in the development industry for the past 10 years or so, and while working on different technologies and different platforms, it was really important for me to understand the difference between the different platforms and frameworks and different programming languages even. And when starting with WordPress, it was quite challenging for me to understand the way it actually works, which means complying with all the standards, building the platform with the differences compared to some MVC frameworks and stuff like that. So in order to make it to make my way easier, I had to really dig into the architecture in the core to understand why does WordPress work this way, what are the differences, what are the pros and the cons, and given my experience with other platforms and technologies, I used all of that all together to make a good comparison chart per se of WordPress and its good and bad parts as software framework architecture. So the only thing that I'd like to mention is that we'll have probably about 5 minutes Q&A at the end of the session, and you can use the crowdcast at wordsesh.org/live. You can use it and ask questions, and I'm going to try to follow up, just as Scott mentioned. Use the questions form in the crowdcast, and I'll be looking there at the end of the presentation and trying to answer some of your questions accordingly. So, without any further ado, I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to focus on our talk. So, like I said, we're going to discuss the WordPress code architecture. We are going to mention some of the leading factors for the core idea, for the main reason WordPress was built, whether it's pros and why is it that popular. We're going to focus on the front end and the back end part, the themes, the theme hierarchy and the back end as well, mentioning the users or the user model or some other factors around it to the user management, database manipulation, some helpers such as forms and such, and some other factors related to developing and building on top of WordPress itself. A few words about me. I'm the WordPress architect at Devrix, which is a premium WordPress agency building software as a services and frameworks and other things. I'm Java certified programmer, and I've done different software solutions based on Java, on PHP, and Python. I'm also the WordPress ambassador at SiteGround. I'm working for their managed WordPress hosting solution and helping them contribute back to WordPress, submitting patches and other stuff to improve the entire WordPress management platform. On Twitter, I'm NoFearing with underscores, and I'm also an open source addict and officer. So if you hang out at Starbucks or Costa or something, and if you see a laptop full of stickers and a beardy guy working there, it's probably me. I'd like to start with a quick warning. So these are all personal opinions about different platforms. So it's my own research over the years. It's my own perspective on the platform and on everything happening with the technical industry. There are different zealots on different platforms and languages. Some fans of different ways of architecture. It's all a matter of perspective and of preference. So no flame wars intended. Just take all of it with a grain of salt and decide what's the good part of it and what could be refined further. There's that famous thing about the good code, and we're all trying to find the way to build the best code ever. So you might start a project and do the things right or do them fast. You can decide, does it work, does it not work, is the code fine or not, can we refine it, can we fix it, and at the end we are all ending up, we throw it all out and start over. And the good code part is does always start with some magical or mystical feature that we don't know anything about. So good code is mostly a mythical thing that no one has ever seen in practice, but we all really hope to reach it one day, probably when we find the way to make everything out of gold or stuff like that. But in practice it's really hard to find a way to write good code by definition, just because it's really subjective. And since we're all in the WordPress industry and we're trying to write good code for our best platform, we need to know some of the leading factors for making WordPress the platform that it is at the moment, with over 23% of the web currently based on top of WordPress. For all we know, WordPress is built on top of PHP, which is the most widespread language across hosting vendors. You know that if you're looking for a hosting provider, PHP is going to be supported by almost all of them. If WordPress was built on Python or Java or anything else, it wouldn't have been like this, just because it would have been hard to find reliable hosting that's also affordable for having the platforms. For example, I remember installing, I don't know, OpenJava or OpenCMS, something built on top of Java 5 years ago, and the install process took 2 hours alone. So it's also inspired by B2 catalog, which is different by Rails and MVC frameworks. It's by definition the lowest possible PHP version supported by WordPress is 5.2.4. And we need to make sure that we support this PHP version when we are building things for the WordPress platform, and also plugins if we want them to run as good as possible to different installs. And the most popular configurations are LAMP or LAMP stacks that run PHP applications and WordPress in particular. The main differences between PHP and the platform behind WordPress and other platforms is that, for example, PHP is stateless and it's also single-threaded, which is important to take into account when we are talking about different platforms that are not stateless, but they have some persistent layer that stays as an application pool around the entire application, and also other platforms and languages that are being multi-threaded. So it's important when we are building the architecture to keep that in mind and either comply with the fact that PHP is single-threaded, or use other approaches such as Linux processes, just starting new processes or new threads, or just starting another platform built on another language that's not single-threaded, in order to make, for example, multi-thread application and make use of different CPUs, different cores in the CPUs, the multi-threaded technology in some cores, and other aspects that make several processes running simultaneously. WordPress is not MVC based and doesn't even have complete object-oriented programming support. This might look a bit weird to people who are used to writing Java or .NET. I, for one, came from the Java world, and it was really tough for me to have just some lines of code lying around. It's not trivial for new people to get used to that, but for PHP developers, it's fairly straightforward. The other thing is that there are a bunch of content management systems that have started based on top of frameworks. So, like for example, we have, I don't know, we have Rails, and then we have a bunch of CMS built on top of Rails. On the other hand, the way that WordPress started as an application platform, which is what Matt Mullenweg mentioned at the State of the World in San Francisco, is that it used to be a blogging platform which emerged into the CMS market. Now it's an established CMS, and it also starts to be used as an application platform for which a framework is required, and the framework is sort of extracted from the existing CMS. There are no non-traditional data storage layers, and there's no REST supporting core. We were just expecting for it to be in core this month, but it was again delayed for probably the next WordPress version. So yeah, it's something that we need to comply with, and just something that we need to be aware of while building applications. The 5.2.4 PHP support is another thing that we need to know about and we need to comply with if you want to build widespread applications or plugins that run on hundreds of thousands of millions of or millions of websites. It means that we can't use namespaces, so the packaging of an application is a little bit different, and it's not trivial having that other languages have that from day one, such as, I don't know, Java with the packages or .NET with their namespaces. We can't use traits, which are small reusable components. We can do expression functions code as class static methods, and we also don't have late static binding, which might be a bit troublesome about building object-oriented architecture by extending classes and calling static functions by identifying the context. We can't use closures if we use 524, which again is a bit tricky, or we also don't have dynamic access to static methods, which again, similar to the class with expression methods, it's a bit tricky if we really want to make an application that's fully dynamic and just avoid writing a lot of code for some boilerplate functions. So focusing about the front end, one of the most popular things that you've probably seen is the WordPress template hierarchy file. You can just find it in the codex, or you can type in wphierarchy.com and you can see the full template hierarchy. So we have the index.php, which is the main file, which is responsible for everything. A theme by default can just run with index.php and style CSS, and that might be a complete theme doing everything. Then we have different main files such as page.php, single.php, archive.php, that could be responsible for example, pages, for all single posts and archive. Then these are all splitting and branching into other different components that we can use. For example, single dash page type, so what's the page type and the page name, single dash post, and everything else, even using IDs, using permalinks. It's really a robust and very flexible hierarchy. It means that the thing that I love in most frameworks and application layers and systems is that whenever we have two ways of doing something that doesn't require any code if we know how to use it, but at the same time we can write a lot of code and get out of the box without being limited by different boundaries. Most platforms and most languages have problems with either of those. So they either require a lot of boilerplate code to be written in order to run the application, or they limit you in a way that it's really, really hard to get out of that box. So having this template hierarchy, you can just comply with the file names and with the templates, and you can do everything on your own, by even using a single index.php file, which is not a bad practice, I tell you. But you can also create all sorts of single template files and even create page dash, I don't know, homepage, and it's going to change all of your homepage pages to use this template name. So it's really, really flexible. If we compare it to other platforms such as Laravel, Cake.php, or Rails on the Ruby side, we have different sort of layers such as layouts. Then we have views within these layouts, and we also have elements. It's a way to do templates which have just a wrapper. For example, we have the head part of the HTML file. We have the footer part, probably some container like main or container or wrapper, and then we have all the single views used from the different pages. So you know that the front end is pretty much looks alike for different pages. So we have the entire template with the HTML file as a layout. Then we have a view for single page or single post or single news or whatever it's used in that system. And then you have elements, some little files such as the menu bars, the sidebars, or anything that's being reused across the views as well. This is the way some MVC frameworks use to display the front-end part of their applications, and it's another way to think of it when we are building plugins. There are a bunch of plugins for polls, for quizzes, or for other things that are using this model, so that you have a reusable wrapper layer, then you have views for everything, and you also have some reusable components that you can embed within every single view. There are other issues, or there are other ways to build stuff with PHP and build front-end work. So one of the biggest issue for most people is that they have to enter the opening and closing PHP tags all the time. It's not clear when does an opening tag start and when does it end. It's not clear whether to use, for example, for each with colons and then end for each, or with opening and closing brackets, and it just looks ugly for small snippets. You can use Smarty or some other template engine like Twig and make it look a bit better, but an example from Razorview, which is part from ASP.NET and from their MVC, model framework, is that we can, for example, do a for each, which is just calling a. Imagine it's almost the same as in PHP for each. You don't have any opening and closing tags. You have the brackets, and then immediately afterwards you start typing HTML code. And whenever you need to add some dynamic data, you just start with. You just start and type your code. That's pretty much what happens. Which is pretty nice. I mean, it's really good to be able to just define HTML and then just define a dynamic component that needs to be displayed without having to deal with all those boilerplate. That's hard for people to understand and very easy to mess up. So yeah, just using the @ sign and building the dynamic component, everything works and everything just loads out of the box. It's really great. So what we can strive for is building template engines that work this way, that are smart enough that they can differentiate between HTML tags, just some dynamic components, and use them accordingly. Another example is from Ajax. This is from JSF, which is the enterprise leading Java framework. So they have HTML tags building different blocks, which are a bit tricky, but these are the components that are using in JSF. And whenever they need to do Ajax, instead of writing all of the JavaScript code, which is really tough, especially for non-JavaScript developers, it's just using a component which says Ajax render this thing from this object. So it's pretty much a one-liner that decides render this thing by pulling off this from this object. You can see that instead of writing 15 lines of JSF, which are pulling different stuff, for example, we need to do Ajax, get a PHP object, get its data, and then render it within a message. We can just write a one-liner, have an object pool of beans, which are plain objects with data, and then render it in a given field. It's similar to ng model and ng bind if you use AngularJS, the first version. So some of you might be familiar with that approach. But again, we're not discussing how to build, for example, .NET applications or JSF applications. It's just an example of what do .NET developers use on a daily basis as a front-end model, and what do JSF developers use as an Ajax model. And think about how is it possible to use it in a WordPress environment? How is it possible to build frameworks that are smart enough to work like that and just save a lot of effort and pain and mistakes by us as developers? Going to the backend section of the WordPress core, we have this flexible default admin panel, which is awesome. We have complete views and listings for post types, so we can list posts and pages. We have all the CRUD views. We have the comments view, the media view, entire views that we can use. We have the user management and capability control, which is incredibly powerful. There are a lot of capabilities that you can add. New rows, it's really granular so that we can use it in the best way possible. We also have the reusable WP list table components so that we can extend the existing views. So that's what we have in WordPress by definition right now. But what if we need alternative admins? For example, if we take a look at different content management systems, we can see that they use different admin approaches for each one of them. Some of them have scaffolded admin panels from web frameworks. Some of them have admin components and user management extensions that they can add. So that there's this extensibility versus complexity dilemma. What I'm talking about is, for example, what happens if we need a really simplified admin panel for WordPress that only allows for adding views, right? We don't really have that. Yeah, we can create an author who's only responsible for the post management, but he's going to use the very same admin dashboard. Almost everything needs to be loaded either way, even if it's hidden and just not rendered, but it still needs to be loaded. The view is a bit, you can change the default list view for listing posts or adding a new post or anything like that. Or that's one of the reasons why we have so many front-end editors and other plugins like visual builders and stuff like that happening now in WordPress, just because you always have to comply with the same admin view, and sometimes it's a problem. Also, some web frameworks just do scaffolding. So they say, for example, we have posts, we have pages, we have users. By scaffolding, most frameworks do have them. They just say, okay, we now have a CRUD, which is creating, retrieving, updating, and deleting posts, the same one for pages, the same one for users, and that's my entire panel. Sometimes we don't need the plugin stuff, we don't need the tool stuff, we don't need the settings, we just need a very simple panel for some set of users with a different user experience and user interface than the default one used by the admins. And that's not quite possible with WordPress, and it is in other CMSs. So we can see what sort of goodies other frameworks or platforms have, and see what are the best ways to reuse them and apply the same user experience to users that are using our WordPress applications. Another thing for data APIs. So we have wrappers and facade. These are all design patterns. All of them are wrapped across post types. So the concept just provides different layers to easily create post types, get data from there, get post beta, and other things. We have unification in options, which means that we have, for example, add option and get option and everything, set theme mode, set transient. In essence, all of them are using the same table. So all of them are storing data in the options table, but they're used for different things, and we can use them as a unified process, even if we are doing different things with them, which is fairly important. We do automatically serialize complex objects, which is also important. It's easier for developers, but it's something that we need to know while we are building our application, because serialization might be fairly tricky, and we'll give another example about that fairly soon. Some things about verifying for whether new records exist or not, what to do there, how to create revisions. And also, we have APIs for sanitizing data, escaping, and validating, in essence. So it's fairly nice the way the data APIs work, even though we have different concepts about, for example, posts and pages and all the post types. And then we have the menus, which are also post types per se. But then we have the users, which are completely different things. We have the comments, which are, again, completely different thing. But having Drupal, for example, they have this thing called entity from, I think it was the last Drupal version. So entity is pretty much everything. So they have everything that we have, like post types, they call it nodes. And they also have the comments, they also have the users, so everything is entity. The reasons I'm mentioning that is that it might be very flexible to use everything as an entity. Imagine if, for example, you need to just pull activities, like what happened for a website, and you just need to pull the latest 20 activities, which means created posts, edited pages, added comments, new users, signed up for the website and stuff like that. Currently, you need to pull the posts table for all of the post type related actions. You need to pull the comments tables for all the new comments. You need to pull the users table for all new users and everything like that. If everything was an entity, everything would have been stored at the same table, or at least have a decent wrapper, so that you can just say pull the last 20 entities, which would pull all the pages and posts, all the comments, and all the users, and sort them accordingly, which is really flexible. Some details about the environment. So the default infrastructure in WordPress now is that we have the admin dashboard, we have some user management components related to users and rows, we have the post type content, we have comments as a separate, API and structure and model itself. We have the template management, and we have media. So like all of this is included in WordPress. You can use all of it. Everything is available in the admin. Everything is available, to just create dynamic templates or anything like that in the front end. So you can pretty much rely on all of that. But the problem is that they're not available as separate modules or components. The reason I'm mentioning that is that, for example, I don't know, about 7 or 8 years ago, one of the Drupal versions worked in a way that when you try to install it, for example, it says, okay, you only have the core, which is pretty much our framework, and then you can download an extension, which is the CMS extension or the block extension or some other extension. So there's a way, since WordPress is growing, a lot of features are being added, but some things cannot be detached. So, for example, what happens if I want to make my install a bit lighter, a bit, just not as heavy, not as complicated, and I want to remove the comments and the media. I just need to be able to add new posts without media and use the template management and user management. All of the media stuff being used there, including probably the customizer and including all the media uploader APIs, everything with the backbone that's being used there. Everything stays in the WordPress core, regardless of the fact that we might not actually need it. And these are not detachable components. And it's the same with the admin dashboard. You can just remove some components. You can hide them. You can check whether you need to load them or not. But they're not plug-in features. They're more of opt-out features with some filters. Speaking of filters, the way that WordPress works is using actions and filters, which are the hooks in the WordPress context. Other languages and other platforms use different approaches to do modular programming by adding plugins, extensions, modules, or whatever. And most of them use annotations or attributes to add dynamic behavior to different classes, especially for object-oriented programming languages that always include classes for building their components and their processes. So the lifecycle model currently is streamlined instead of layer-based. What does it mean? The way that PHP works, again, we said that it's stateless, we said that it's single-threaded, so every single request loads the entire WordPress core from the start of the index.php file in the core. Then it decides whether it should load the admin panel, the WP admin folder and everything within it, or everything for the front end. It's loading the entire template hierarchy, it's loading all the user management, all the query management, all the database settings. All of that happens on every single page load. So it's a streamlined process. It's something that happens from the first point of the WordPress core to the very last point, and it loads every single time. Which is one of the reasons we need caching, by the way, but still. So that's how it works. On the other hand, some other platforms and languages and just frameworks, they use the layer-based application lifecycle. So, for example, they have some verticals that are loaded on demand. Like, for example, now we need to do something with the pages. We don't need to, load absolutely everything. We just need to load the entire page model, do stuff like that, and then get rid of the memory being used by the pages model. So it's a good way of thinking when and how to load some applications and load some data, even though it might be dependent on the programming language, and apparently we can't really rewrite WordPress in Python or other language. So examples for just adding extra functionality or injecting some features in other languages is, again, the JSF framework being used as an example. So we have a general class. You might get used to the syntax. It's similar to PHP to some extent. So you have a class which is some registered bean. It's just some sample class for user, which is registered user. So you have a email, a string field, you have a username, you have password. So that's a default class. But when we create that, we can also set, okay, it's a managed bean, so it's by default used by our application. It's just a note here. We can say that it's request scoped, so the life cycle of this bean is just between the current request and the next request. Imagine submitting a form, so all of the data in this object is going to be stored between the current form, when we are typing in everything, we submit it, and the next request is going to have all this data. But the third request that we got, this bean is going to be empty. No data would be stored by just passing this single line of code. Then adding some validation. What should we do in WordPress? Well, we either need to do a first we need to do a JavaScript layer for front-end validation. We need to change some forms, add validation classes, add this, add that. And then we also need to add back-end validation, apparently. For each form, we need to validate the data that's coming in. We need to do some filtering. We need to, send back to the front-end with some error messages. We need to check the validity of the database columns, like a lot of things related to checking the actual valid data. So here we can just start, for example, again, just have add size. So min size is going to be 1. If there are less than 1 symbols, just enter your email. That's the message that you're going to get. And the pattern that we need is a regular expression, which should have letters and digits, at least 1. Then we need the @ sign. And then we need the same thing. We need to do a dot, and we need to have another thing. So it's just a very, very rough example. I mean, that's the way we do validation. There's a size annotation, we use it, and we say what's the minimum size or the maximum size. There's a pattern, we can define an entire regular expression being applied to this email field. Same goes for username, same goes for password. For example, we might say minimum password is 5 symbols, maximum is 20 symbols. That's the way you do it, So you have your models, you have all your data in one class, which is really easy to see, and you just need to add an @ sign to define some validations. It's really easy for everyone to see. You just open the class and you see everything that needs to be saved needs to comply with that pattern. It's really awesome. And even if you say, okay, but that's Java and you're talking about, a different language, a different platform, that's not quite true, because, for example, you can use the same annotations in PHP. For example, the Doctrine, which is an ORM framework, active record, whatever you want to call it, framework for building database layers. You can just create in a Doctrine class, in a model related to a database table. You can, for example, create a protected ID, and then you can say, okay, it's an ID table, which means that it needs to be, this is the ID table for our column. The column is going to be integer. The generated value is going to be identity, which pretty much means that it's going to be auto-increment. So what I'm saying is that PHP also provides those sort of annotations. That's the way that PHP docs works. When you comment out your functions, you have the author, you have return, you have param. Everything is parsed as a metadata. Everything is parsed, and then some activities are being performed based on your metadata. So you can do that same thing in PHP too. And we can also define some models and add the validation in the models should we need this. Database manipulation, we have the post types API base, we have all the query classes, and lately Bool has been quite active in adding more query data, so props about that. We have the WPDB class, and we also have other helper CRUD functions that we might use as well. But about the database, there are different challenges that we might meet there. So this is the problem with normalization versus denormalization. If you have studied database theory at the university, you know that databases have different normal forms. You have the first, the second, the third, the fourth, some reach to fifth, to sixth, to seventh. It's a way to regroup that database so that you have the least data repetitive while using different objects, and as more modular components as possible just connected to each other, just related in a way or so. But in practice, I mean, the theory is always nice, but it doesn't really come with a practical appliance sometimes. In practice, there are a lot of large projects that need to denormalize their databases and their tables in order to actually provide a valuable mechanism. So, for example, another thing that I like to give as an example is we have the posts, the post table, and then you have the comments table, and then we have a link for each comment for how many. For each comment, what's the post that it's connected to, right? So we have a post, then we have 30 comments, and each comment is connected to the same post ID that we just mentioned like a few seconds earlier. And if you want to get the number of comments related to a post, we need to do a select query to the comments and pass the post ID, which is nice, but if you have a really huge comments table, it might be really tough to do those select queries, and they might take a while. So a really small example for denormalization is adding a comments count column to the posts, and every time that we add or delete a post, we also update the comments count column. So we have repetitive data now. We can easily get, and we have all the comments in the comments table. We can easily select them. We can easily get the number, but we're also duplicating this number in the post column just because it's easier for us. But the thing is that this might save a lot of database queries, and it might make it much easier and much faster, and make our application less intensive by this small number. And the same goes for data decoupling. What needs to be repetitive, what needs to be bundled, how, and everything like that. Most frameworks, most MVC frameworks, both in PHP and in Python and in Ruby and in other languages, they do the database model thing. So the database is built so that every single database table has its own class. All of the classes have relationships so that we can use, classes. We can connect to them. For example, we might get, like something like get post. Then for the post, we can do arrow sign, get comments. Then for the comments, we can get users by this comment. Everything is connected as database tables with connections, which is nice, but it's not really that good in the WordPress context, and that's the reason why we use post types. Instead of creating hundreds of database tables for each post type that we need, everything is stored in the post table, everything is stored in the post meta table, everything from the taxonomies, process is again in the taxonomies or terms tables. So we don't need to do any sort of database changes for standard stuff such as post and taxonomies. And speaking about data storage choices, the fact that we serialize data is also something that we need to keep in mind. You see, for example, selecting some meta box hidden page or menus column here, we have all this serialized data in our database. So we can save a lot of space for that by using serialized data, and get option and update option by default are using serialization. So they're storing an object in the database, and then they're pulling it off as an object, so unserialized data. The only problem here is if we want to do filtering. For example, one of the toughest things when you need to do selection with posts is trying to do some double P query with passing meta key arrays, that a meta key should be within a given value, and then a meta value should have a given value. It's really tough to do this much. The join is a bit tough. It's just a lot of overhead, and that wouldn't have happened if we just had one database column for the meta key, one database column for the meta value, and then just easily do one select to a given line of code or a given row from the database. So it's not how WordPress works, and we need to know that. An example of working with that sort of database tables and models that I just mentioned is Link, or even something like NoSQL. We can get all the posts by this data, this our data layer. We get all of the blog posts. It's just a model, so you see we're using standard words. We are not using some SQL. Well, not exactly SQL. We say where something is like this, order by this, do an inner select, and this select is going to use a model where title equals this, content equals this, this is that, skip, which is doing the offset, and also take some sort of limit. So what I'm saying is it's really easy to read. It's using native objects from languages like currently is from C#. So everything is really easy to manage and change, and the C# developer doesn't need to be really proficient in order to do a very complicated SQL query in order to read all the data. And you can easily match variables to some columns from the database, which also correspond to model fields. So about helpers and utilities, example from Rails is using their form helper, for example. So you have we can easily create a form for articles, which is our model, like imagine it as a database table, or post type being article. We have the URL, which is the part that's handling all the data. So it's like the URL that submits the data to and processes it. And then we can create a text field, text area, and submit button. You see how easy it is. You don't do any sort of HTML. Everything is really straightforward. Everything is really simple. And on top of that, there's a lot of auto magic with all of this. There's the token generation. There's a model-based validation, unified access control. So nonces are being added, model-based validation is applied. Imagine, can you remember the part with the size and with the pattern, the part that's doing the validation a few slides earlier? And there's also unified access control, which is awesome. I really do have high hopes for the settings API. So about 3 years ago, a discussion has been started about the new settings API. It's always been a work in progress, but the current settings API processing forms and you know just creating theme options panels or plugin panels or everything just needs to go through there, and it's really it just doesn't work the way it's supposed to work. So we have high hopes, but it's not there yet. The media uploader is another thing we need to keep in mind. Everything, all the uploads are hidden in WP content, uploads for private documents, but other applications, for example, in Java, they have the webinf folder for the hidden stuff, and like you can add a lot of uploads or other private data there by only being accessible from the web server, but not from the outside. Because, for example, if you have an invoicing application and it's uploading PDFs for your company invoices in the uploads folder, everyone with the link can open your invoices, can read your personal data, your partners or clients' personal data, your financial transactions, and a lot of important data, just because the uploads folder is accessible by definitions by users. And another example from Zend application is, for example, all the core and library and docs and stuff is available at the core of the folder, and then the public folder actually hosts most of the application that's public for people. But if you upload stuff to the core Zend folder, it's not in the public subfolder, so it won't be accessible for people from the outside. So you can easily upload stuff to the core Zend folder without for it to be compromised by just knowing the URL and opening the uploaded data. So these are all options, and alternatives are available, and we can change it or not, but it's important for us to know how other platforms and systems work, and there are good sides, there are bad sides, if your project can use some patterns or some ideas from other platforms. So there are also other ideas for user management, multi-site support, tools or libraries, some routing ideas, a lot of them actually, performance, decisions, security tips or packages or distributions that could be done. For example, WordPress has one of the most mature multi-site supports available out there, and I've done a lot of research about this. There's some, for example, Drupal has, I think they were called distributions, which is just creating a Drupal version with embedded plugins, and you can install it. Like, imagine creating an entire e-commerce store that's WordPress with easy digital downloads or WooCommerce or iTeams Exchange, and like 10 more plugins that make your website a complete one-on-one e-commerce solution just by installing one single package with everything. Just as a Linux distribution, by the way. So WordPress is still awesome, and it's still the platform that we all love, and that's why we're here. There are just some other ways to build an architecture, and there are other languages and platforms with their own strong sides. So since we are ahead of time, if you have any questions, I'm going to check one or two questions from the chat now, but you can find me on LinkedIn, Twitter, my GitHub, or WordPress.org, and I'm going to share the slides fairly soon. In the meantime, I'm going to quickly check the chat. So, are there any questions? Please bear with me and help me and repost your questions so that we don't really waste that much time. Oh, Chuck Norris has learned this from Mario. I like it. Thanks, man. It's really awesome. So, yeah, just scrolling quickly for questions. And yeah, by the way, as my colleague Stanko has mentioned, this presentation is already online, so you can just take a look at the URL, which is talks.devwp.eu/code-architecture. This is available, and of course, it's built on top of WordPress with the HTML5 slideshow presentation plugin. And yeah, so okay, I'll be freeing this slot for the next speaker, so stay with WordSesh, and I'll be here in the chat for the next 15 minutes if you have any questions. Again, the talk is at talks.devwp.eu/code-architecture. At the end, just as last notes, take a look at Exo WP by Mike Shinko. It's an incredible MVC-based PHP framework on top of WordPress that you can use to build WordPress applications. And Nikolai Baczynski, who's a great developer, has a great talk to OOP or not to OOP for the pros and cons of object-oriented programming in the WordPress and PHP context. So definitely take a look at this. So that's all from me, folks. It was a great pleasure seeing all of you. Again, if you have any questions, just ping me on Crowdcast or Twitter, and I'll be here to answer you. Have a good rest of the day and enjoy the rest of WordSesh.